of Iraq today, the Al Jazeera. And then between 1534 and 1538, Iraq came under Ottoman control. It was traded hands several times with the Safavids, but by 1639 it is firmly Ottoman, and it will remain Ottoman down to the First World War. In all of these areas, the Ottoman Sultan had to come to terms with the existing traditions and the ruling elites. Now, the upper levels of the administration of the Arab provinces were clearly Ottomans sent from Constantinople. And you can make dossiers and biographies on all of these figures. Most of them were Muslims from the Balkans. They had come through either the madrasis in Constantinople or they were members of the elite from the Kulu Kapu. That is the servants of the Ottoman in the Topkapi Palace. When they arrived in the Ottoman provinces, many of them probably spoke no Arabic. From what we can tell, many of them probably felt quite isolated in what must have looked like to them an alien land. On the other hand, the Ottomans made sure not to impose the whole system of Timars on the Arabic provinces. There were a couple of exceptions in the area around Mosul and Aleppo, which were all important to control. But on the whole, the military forces in the Arab provinces were overwhelmingly local forces. There were garrisons of janissaries initially stationed in the 16th century, but increasingly these janissary units drew on local recruitment, and that clearly was the case by the 17th century. In addition to that important proviso, the judges who were sent in as the representatives of the Sultan, the Qadi, they almost all spoke Arabic. They had to be trained in Quranic law. They administered Quranic law in the imperial courts, and customary law obtained in the cities, among the guilds, and in the peasants' villages. And so that eased the transition very much from Mamluk or Safavid rule to Ottoman rule in those provinces. Each of the provinces had a different history, a different trajectory, as a modern social historian would say. Let's take Egypt first. Egypt was perhaps the most important province financially for the sultans. It was on par with the Balkans. Its revenues were enormously lucrative, particularly the rice, the sugar, the wheat, and the cotton produced in the Nile Valley that fed the city of Constantinople. The city of Cairo was essentially the rival caliphate city, and it would only reemerge as the intellectual and political rival to Constantinople in the 19th century when it gained its independence again under Muhammad Ali. It was impossible to administer Egypt as if it were a province in the Balkans, and from the start, the Ottoman presence was restricted to Cairo. It very much depended on the permission of the leading families, who went back to the old Mamluk families, who maintained their own personal households. And these households were slaves purchased on the slave market. Many of them were Georgians, Circassians. They came through the slave trade at Kaffa. And in effect, this elite in Cairo, which essentially ran the province of Egypt for the port, is very often known as Neo-Mamluks. It is a reinvented local elite. They came to terms with the janissaries and the governors sent from Constantinople, and the two groups actually fused into a new ruling elite in Cairo by 1600. Whoever controlled the mayor of Cairo, which had to be elected from the leading families, the leading Mamluk families, essentially controlled Egypt. And any governor coming into Egypt had to be acceptable to those leading families of the Neo-Mamluks, as well as the military forces stationed there. And so a kind of power broker situation was worked out between the port in Constantinople and the government in Cairo. And this had become clearly the only solution, because soon after Egypt had been secured, Suleiman the Magnificent faced two major revolts in Egypt. He had to send his Grand Vizier in there to reorganize the province, and it quickly became very, very clear that the Ottoman state would be overtaxed if it tried to rule Egypt directly the way they did provinces in the Balkans or in Asia Minor. Another example of how you co-opt local elites would be Baghdad. Baghdad, when it finally came under the control of the Ottomans effectively from 1639 on as a result of the successful War of Murat IV. Baghdad, in many ways, was a provincial town living on the memories that it once had been a capital of the Caliph. But there again, leading families were co-opted. And in this case, starting in the 17th and early 18th century, there were powerful families who were ions, notables, engaged in the tax farming, and they were able to maintain powerful households of Mamluks, mostly Circassians and Georgians obtained from the Caucasus area. And in effect, they ruled as local figures representing the authority of the Sultan, and they were essentially semi-independent rulers. Nonetheless, they would regard themselves as Ottomans, and they were loyal to the Sultan because their authority in Baghdad rested on the titles, the turbans, the seals of office, and all of the approval of the Ottoman state. And again, it was a very, very sensible way of sharing power between a powerful elite who spoke Arabic, who had the connections to get things done, and at the same time realized that their position rested very much on the backing of the Sultan Caliph in Constantinople. And you see these arrangements made across the Fertile Crescent in the cities of what we today call Syria. In the far west, the Maghreb, in Tunisia and Algeria, the authority was even looser. Their beys protested a loyalty to the Sultan in Constantinople and ruled pretty much independently and really carried out their own pirate raids, the so-called Barbary pirates in popular literature, against the Christian foe in the Western Mediterranean. And they really didn't care what happened at Lepanto. They were engaged in their own war against the Christians, as well as piracy, which after all, they saw as acting as privateers under the authority of the Sultan, to see it from their viewpoint. And so all across the Arab world, there were these compromises. There was a very significant compromise when it came to the holy cities. In 1517, the traditional ruling family was in power. The Hashemites had control of the pilgrimage routes. And the Bedouin tribes along the rim of the Fertile Crescent that guarded those pilgrimage routes were all co-opted as well. As I mentioned before, any governor in Aleppo who did not pay attention to the Hashemites in the Holy City, or tribes like the Mawali who patrolled the eastern frontier of Syria, woe to him if there was any interruption of the Hajj, because that's one thing the Sultan would not tolerate. There was a great deal of independence and latitude given to the tribal communities, the Bedouins. On the other hand, what the Sultan wanted to make sure is his taxes came in, order was kept in the main cities, and the Hajj went forward, because that was crucial to his legitimacy as the Sultan Caliph. And that system was more or less in place down to 1915, with one exception we'll get to in a moment. In 1915, when Prince Hussein finally kicked in with the British in the so-called Arab Revolt, he was very, very leery of shaking off that Ottoman tutelage, because it had been so profitable for his family so long, and he was really forced to make a decision, and rather reluctantly went in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire and against the traditions of his family, which was a very, very lucrative arrangement. To give you some sense of how powerful those locals were at the court of Constantinople, when the railway system was being built in the 19th century, the railway system was extended from Aleppo eventually to Medina, but it was never extended to Mecca, because the tribes protested, including the Hashemites, that would cut into their revenues on the Hajj trade, and that was unacceptable. And if you didn't want to have a rebellion of the Arab tribes, you better not build the railway, and the threat worked. The Sultan backed off on the idea. Abdul Hamid II would not alienate those tribes. It was too important that the Hajj continue. So I mentioned that there were some exceptions to the at least passive acceptance of the Ottoman Sultan. One was Egypt. I mentioned earlier that from the start, to his credit, Suleiman and his immediate successors understood that Egypt was an exceptional province. It's just too large. It has a long tradition of independent sultanates going back into the 9th century. And there was always a danger that a powerful governor might break away and create a government in Egypt. And that became very clear at the end of the 18th century. A member of one of the leading families, one of the Neo-Mamluk families, got himself elected as mayor in 1768. He is known as Ali Bey El-Kabir. From his position as mayor, he could dictate who the governor of Egypt should be. Very much the Mamelukes and the so-called Janissaries, who at this point are all essentially local military forces, lined up with him. He conducted virtually his own foreign policy vis-a-vis the French and evaded the Sultan's writ when it came to export-import quotas of grain to Marseille. He profited immensely on the growing trade with the French under the old capitulations of 1740. And he hired a large army that some would number as much as 25,000 men. And these included large numbers of slave soldiers bought on the slave market. And invariably, there was going to be a head-on collision with the Sultan in Constantinople, and it broke out in 1771 when he literally ordered his personal army, Ali Bey, to march on the city of Damascus and overthrow Ottoman rule in the Levant and seize the Levantine ports, which were essential for defending Egypt. Clearly, he was thinking of breaking away. The army got to Damascus, and then the governor rebelled and defected over to the Sultan. He sent in another army in 1772. That was defeated. And a year later, finally, with naval and military forces, the Ottomans reoccupied Egypt and imposed the authority of the Sultan on the Nile Valley. It was a very, very strong warning of the danger of what could happen in Egypt. And the Ottoman control in Egypt by the end of the 18th century had become quite tentative. And when Napoleon shows up in 1798, not too long from now, you can understand why the Sultan, Selim III, was so distressed. He saw an outsider, once again, reviving the potential rival in Cairo. The other place, which was unexpected, was in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, I mentioned that the Sultan really had very, very little interest of what was going on in the Arabian Peninsula, so long as the caravans of pilgrims made it to Mecca and Medina. And that meant the only areas effectively controlled were the Hajj, that is the area around Medina and Mecca, which was in the hands of the Hashemites. Well, in the early 18th century, an inspired mentor, a prophetic figure emerged. His name is Abd al-Wahid. His followers are now known as the Wahhabists. Abd al-Wahhab preached against the Ottoman pietism. He did not see any reason why memorial tombs should be venerated, as was common in Sunni Islam in the Ottoman period. He railed against all the relics that had been collected in the Topkapi Palace, from the sword of the prophet to the beard of the prophet. All of this was nothing more than heathenism. Anything that was not consistent with the religion of Islam at the time of the prophet was obviously an abomination. And that included a Turkish caliph. It also included almost everything that would be associated with the Shiite tradition, which was upheld by the rulers of Iran. And the Wahhabists made common cause with the powerful tribes in the central Arabian desert, the House of Saud, who later would give their name to Saudi Arabia. Muhammad ibn Saud linked his fortunes, linked his Bedouin warriors to this new Sunni fundamentalism. And his son and successor carried that in a war against the pilgrimage shrines that were under the protection of the Ottoman Sultan. In 1802, Wahhabists mounted on camels sacked the city of Karbala, a great Shiite site. There was a massacre. And while these were Shiites, many of them were Ottoman subjects, or they were pilgrims from Iran that were under the protection of the Sultan Caliph. In 1803, they occupied Mecca. They came back in 1805 and 1806. They disrupted the pilgrimage trades. 3 times, the Sultan Mahmud II or his predecessor, Ahmed III, had sent armies against the Wahhabists into the desert to no effect. In 1811, out of desperation, Sultan Mahmud II, the man who will destroy the Janissaries in 1826, turns to Muhammad Ali, the independent ruler in Egypt, and asks him to crush the Wahhabists. And it takes 2 expeditions for him as well. It is only the second one, in 1817, 1818, when his most talented son, Ibrahim, gains control of the bases of the Wahhabists and ends this Wahhabist state. But it had tested the Ottoman Sultanate to the extreme. The loss of those holy cities, the emergence of a fundamentalist group like that, that raised doubts within all the Arab provinces. If the Turkish Caliph can't protect us, is he still Caliph? And the experience of dealing with the Wahhabists would haunt the Sultan Caliph through the rest of Ottoman history. And they were painfully aware that their position rested provisionally on their ability to defend the Islamic world. It is always ironic to me that there were two events at the end of the empire that really tested this long loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. One were all the modern reforms brought in that tried to bring a central state into the Arab provinces after 1909 especially. That alienated the local elites. That brought an intrusive Ottoman rule in provinces that had long been able to govern themselves with a nominal loyalty to Constantinople. And then, the most ignominious of all, was defeat at the hands of the Italians in Libya in 1911-1912. That is the first time an Arab land had actually been lost by an Ottoman army. To the weakest of all the European powers, a province that was not very important, but it undermined the authority of the Sultan Caliph and really was never forgotten by the reformers who had fought in that war, and they remembered that defeat and its consequences when the First World War broke out. But until those defeats in the 19th and early 20th century, for 300 years, the Sultan had pursued a very sensible policy that had won over his Arabic subjects, that had seen the flourishing of later Arabic literature, and had given prosperity and peace to provinces that had long been ravaged by war in the late Middle Ages. And again, that is a remarkable achievement for the Turkish Caliph Sultan in Constantinople.
Lecture 14, Christians and Jews under the Porte.
In this lecture, we want to continue the theme of the diverse populations of the Ottoman Empire. And this involves the dhimmi, or zimmi, as they would be called in Ottoman Turkish, the non-believers. They would be Christians and Jews who comprised a considerable amount of the Ottoman state. It's easy to think of the Ottoman Empire as a Turkish empire, and in the last lecture I stressed how much of the population was Arabic, and now we want to look at the other two big groups that formed significant parts of the population, and those are the Christians and the Jews. It's easy to forget that the Ottoman Sultan ruled almost all of the Orthodox populations and all of the various churches of the East, as they're often called, with the exception of Orthodox Russia and Ethiopia. They also ruled over an enormous number of Jewish communities. And at least in the 15th and 16th century, Jews were far better off in the Ottoman Empire than they were in Western Europe. In order to understand this issue, it is important for us to look at several matters. First, who were the Jews and Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and how many were there? It is a very diverse set of groups of people who gave their loyalty to the Sultan Caliph who were not Muslims. Then we also want to look at how were they accommodated under essentially an Islamic regime. And finally, we want to look at the fortunes first of the Jews and then of the Christians under the Ottoman Sultan. So perhaps it's first best to look at who were all of these different groups of people in the Ottoman state. The Jews represented various groups. In 1453, there was a largely Greek-speaking community in Constantinople in the district known as Bant. And that community became the nucleus of the Jewish community of Imperial Constantinople. Mehmed II appointed the leading rabbi there in the main synagogue as essentially the spokesman for the Jewish community of his empire. That was a man by the name of Moshe Kapalisi. He was a very close friend to Mehmed, and he was also a friend to Bayezid II, and he held a position of honor at the Divan. That community was reinforced by more immigrants coming from Spain, the Rhineland, and Poland. And we'll talk about that later in the lecture. The Christian community was even more diverse, and the Christian community increased with Ottoman conquests. First and foremost, there were the Orthodox churches. Those were the churches that recognized the authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople, and many of those churches were Greek-speaking, but others were Romanian or a Slavic language, Bulgarian, Serbian, Serbo-Croatian, all of those languages represented in the liturgy based on the Old Church Slavonic invented by Methodius and Cyril back in the 9th century. And in time, with the exception of Orthodox Russia, all of those Orthodox people came under the control of the Sultan, and they were heavily concentrated in the Balkans and in the islands of the Aegean, in Crete, in Cyprus, and they were well represented in Asia Minor, especially in the coastal districts, up until really 1923. In addition to the Orthodox populations, there were older Christian communities to the east, first and foremost the Armenians, who would have a very, very different history than the Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule. And then older churches, the so-called Monophysite churches in Syria, that were centered around the monasteries near Mardin. That is the Syrian Orthodox Church, which is still there today, and now has its episcopal see in Damascus, sometimes known as the Syrian Church. The Coptic Church in Egypt, old Nestorian churches out in the mountainous zones of what is now eastern Turkey in the regions of Hakkari. All of these older Christian communities also came under Ottoman control. And so it was a very, very diverse population. And increasingly in the 16th and 17th century, there were also Catholic Christians, especially the city of Ragusa on the Dalmatian shore, that were also numbered among the subjects of the Sultan, and as we'll see later on, conversions to Catholic and even Protestant Christianity in the 18th and 19th centuries. All of them were classified as dhimmi. And in terms of their numbers, the best guess is in 1600, perhaps 30% of the empire's population was Christian, and so you're talking about somewhere around the order of 4 to 5 million people. This is a very large population indeed in what is a Muslim empire. The Ottoman sultans succeeded to a long-established legal system for dealing with non-believers, dhimmi, that is Christians and Jews, and this goes back to the very beginnings of the Islamic conquest. Arabic writers claim that there was a convention or a treaty that was brokered by the second caliph named Omar, who either with the surrender of Jerusalem or the surrender of Byzantine Syria, the accounts vary, offered an arrangement to the Christian populations that if they paid a head tax to practice their religion, that they would not be interfered with. Furthermore, their religious leaders would answer for the Christian communities to the caliph. And that tradition had become very, very well established when Osman and Orhan organized the Sultanate at Bursa in the 14th century. And the later Ottoman sultans very judiciously and very cleverly expanded this into a very, very clearly defined legal system that we often call the millet system. Millet refers to the Turkish word for nationality, and nationality in effect was defined by religion, just as I discussed with the Arabic populations of the Ottoman Empire in a previous lecture. And so people were classified by their religion, put into a national category, a millet. Those nationalities, under the rule of the Sultan, had certain rights and privileges. They could continue to practice their religion, and their religious leaders would speak for them vis-a-vis the Sultan Caliph. And this has often been hailed as an unusual case of toleration in an age where religious toleration was not the norm. And when looked at from the 16th and 17th century, particularly in comparison to Western Europe, which was torn apart by the Reformation, the way the different religious groups operated in the Ottoman Empire was really quite extraordinary. Now, this is not toleration as the word is understood in modern languages today. But it is toleration in the literal sense of the Latin word that gave rise to that word, tolo, tolere, sub sulu, sub latus, a very irregular third conjugation verb, in which I suffer you to exist. I suffer you. I permit you to continue. That doesn't mean any approval, that doesn't mean any deep understanding of what this other religion is all about, but it is mandated by the prophet who is speaking the word of God that the people of the book, the dhimmi, should not be disturbed by the believers so long as they followed the proper rules. Now, that toleration had a number of important limits. And by the time that the Ottoman sultans are implementing it, it is clear that Jews and Christians are tolerated, but they are second-class citizens. They are part of the Riaya, but they're not part of the Ummah, the community of believers. They could never take service with the Ottoman Sultan unless they converted to Islam and embraced the whole ethos of the Ottoman ruling elite and learned Turkish. They were allowed their churches, but there again, there were certain restrictions. This didn't bother the Jews so much because the Jews were accustomed to living as a minority under imperial powers, and their system of synagogues were well adapted. But for every Christian group, when it first came under Muslim rule, it was a change. Churches could not have bells because it would annoy the believers. Churches had to assume increasingly an inconspicuous appearance in the city. In Constantinople, over the course of the 16th century, every domed church in the city was appropriated and turned into a mosque. Christian churches had to be walled off and not seen from the street. The public festivals associated with Eastern Christendom, those could no longer continue. Services had to be conducted in churches. And that led to a sort of psychological as well as physical separation of the Christian populations in Ottoman cities that led them to be isolated from their Muslim neighbors. And while Christians and Jews mingled with Muslims in the workplace, especially in guilds, we know that there are many guilds with mixed religious groups in the markets, when it came to religious practices and socializing, they stayed very much within their own little communities, either within their household or within districts within a city that were essentially largely Christian or Jewish. And that was within keeping of these restrictions. Furthermore, they were not allowed to bear arms, Jews or Christians. They were not to ride horses. They were to assume a very distinct dress, although this was often honored more in the breach than the reality in Constantinople. And so throughout all of these laws, it's clear that the Muslims are in a position of superiority. Now, on the other hand, there was no forced conversions. The Devshirme was a sort of forced conversion, that was the levy. There are instances of many slaves who were Christians or Jews being encouraged to convert by their masters. But there was nothing like the wholesale expulsion of Christians from the Ottoman Empire that would be equivalent to what the kings of Spain did, that is, expelling its Jewish and Muslim subjects who refused to convert to Catholic Christianity. There's nothing like the decree of 1492 issued by Isabel and Ferdinand II, the Alhambra decree that essentially ran the Jewish community to Constantinople, or the later expulsions issued by Philip III. That just didn't happen. In addition, conversions to Islam were thought they had to be sincere, and there was a series of conversions to Islam throughout the Ottoman period. But again, many of these were individual decisions. They were taken for various reasons, some in order to gain advantages to join the administration. In the case of conversions in Bosnia, around the city of Sarajevo, that was established as a Muslim fortress city by Mehmed II. It developed into a Muslim city, and many of the Christian landlords there received timars, and they converted to Islam in order to maintain their timars. There is also conversion of Albanian pastoralists in the Balkans, and that was a result of Sufi mystics moving among them and mixing the folklore of the Albanians with Sufi mysticism, very similar to conversions of Christians in Asia Minor in the 13th century. But on the whole, there was not a concerted effort by the Ottoman religious establishment to convert Christians and Jews as a policy. And that meant that these communities could continue to flourish under the Ottoman state. And their fortunes varied depending on their circumstances at the time of the Ottoman conquest. Without a doubt, the Jews probably did the best. And this was because under the previous Byzantine rule in Constantinople, they were not particularly well treated. And there's been some very, very good studies on that. Mehmet II appreciated his Jewish subjects. First and foremost, they were loyal. They did not pose a threat. Another point about them, the colony in Constantinople in 1453 included many men who were engaged in merchandising and commercial activities. They spoke Italian, they spoke Western European languages, and above all, they were in close contact with their co-religionists in other commercial cities across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And this facilitated their role as merchants in international trade. They had co-religionists and relatives in cities stretching along the Silk Road or through the Mediterranean world in the ports, with whom they could deal on letters of credit, information on banking, people who would stand as surety. So they were obviously to be appreciated. Another important point about them is they were loyal to the Ottoman state, and when they were driven out of Spain, they came in great numbers and willingly accommodated themselves to the social milieu of Constantinople. One good example is a figure of the 16th century, a man by the name of Joseph Nasi from Portugal. He had been forcibly baptized. He left Portugal. He had had time in the Netherlands and the Rhineland. And he arrived in Constantinople in the reign of Selim II and rose to high rank. He was able to carry out all sorts of contracts for the Ottoman state, particularly for the provisioning of the city. He was actually invested with minor gubernatorial powers in the Greek islands and even considered to run either the Wallatian or the Romanian Principality as the hereditary prince. This was a remarkable position for a man who was not a Muslim. And his family stood in very, very high regard in Jewish communities, and his descendants included many of the leading Torah scholars of the 16th and 17th century. The Jewish community in Constantinople prospered. It was reinforced by Ladinos, that is Spanish speakers coming in from Iberia. They in turn invited relatives and co-religionists from the Rhineland and Poland. They were so important that they were given a position in Salonika or Thessalonica in northern Greece for carrying out all sorts of important trades engaged in supplying the city. And by 1600, 55% of Salonika was probably Jewish. The various diverse synagogues, which represented different national groups, had merged into a single synagogue. The communities had more or less coalesced. And the city of Constantinople could well have had as many as 20 to 25% Jewish residents who were important in all sorts of businesses, right down to the coffee shops and the wine shops, to the ferry boats, to the contracting and the supply of Ottoman armies. And so these communities would persist in holding these important positions down to the end of the empire. The Christian communities had a more varied set of circumstances. Simply put, the vast majority of Christians under Ottoman rule probably remained peasants, living in villages, practicing a traditional way of life. This is very much true in the Balkans, where the vast majority of the population in the Balkans, with the exception of those conversions among the Albanians and the Bosnians, or the Turkish immigrants who moved into eastern Thrace, now European Turkey, most of the Balkans, whether they were the principalities of the Romanians or whether they were Ottoman provinces, remained Orthodox Christian and would reemerge as nation-states in the 19th century. And this is a remarkable story in and of itself. It was a result of several reasons. First and foremost, the Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople in 1454, Gennadius II, was invested with the powers to speak for the entire Orthodox Church. And that included the Slavic churches, the Romanian churches, as well as the Greek-speaking churches. Those churches were now protected. And most of those churches remembered very, very bitterly the issues arising over the Great Schism, and above all, the poisoned relations for over 200 years over the recognition of papal authority in return for Western aid, which never came. And most of the Orthodox Christians were willing to tolerate an Ottoman Sultan who brought ordered, peaceful rule and did tax them, sometimes in the form of money, sometimes in the form of young men taking the devshirme, but did not molest their institutions and allowed them to retain their faith and keep their souls. And so, really, until the 19th century, Well, the end of the 18th century with the great Russian victories of Catherine the Great, perhaps. That's when these Orthodox populations begin to move against the Sultan. These Orthodox populations were more than willing to accept Ottoman rule. Point that's sometimes not very popular among nationalists of the 19th century who try to conjure up the image of the Ottoman Empire as simply a period of occupation, and it wasn't. There were many advantages to Ottoman rule for the Orthodox population. Another reason, and a little more frivolous reason, is that in the Balkans, the pig was an absolute essential animal for diet, and that probably helped prevent many of the Slavic peasants and Greek peasants from going over to Islam. And again, it's tossed out as a number of reasons. But the Balkans were not converted. The Balkans remained overwhelmingly Christian. Study of population figures in the 16th and 17th century will bear it out. A city might have an Ottoman military elite in a place like Larissa in central Greece, Thessaly. It was largely a Muslim city by 1650, but the surrounding countryside is overwhelmingly Christian. And this was a feature in the Balkans that persisted down to the 19th century. The other important church, besides the Orthodox Church, was the Armenian Apostolic Church. This was the independent Armenian church that refused to accept the Council of Chalcedon, that established its own Catholicus or leader at the Council of Divin in 553. And this church was originally located in the historic lands of Armenia. But the Armenians had traveled across the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians, just like the Greeks, would exploit many of the opportunities in trade,